now. And really, thank you, Erica, for coming along this evening. I'm really interested in Fanon's phenomenological psychopolitical therapy, which you're going to explore. Erica, I think the people here know, is a professor in, I think, Department of Education, isn't it? At the University of Manchester, fellow of the British Psychological Society, all sorts of things, and as was referred to earlier, a group analyst, and written loads of tremendous stuff. It's influenced us, and hopefully we're going to be very influenced this evening. Erica, you know, we normally ask talk and then take some questions, or if you want to mix and match, yeah, whatever. So Erica, over to you, please.
Thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here talking with you. Can you all hear me okay? Is the volume okay? Right. Before I share my screen and then lose sight of all of you, can I check, have all of you heard of Frantz Fanon? Yeah, lots of thumbs up. I won't do any shaming of who hasn't. Taya and I were talking about Fanon, so have any of you, would any of you say you've read his work in great detail, just to know how to pitch it?
Not in great detail.
Oh, some kind of, a little bit, yeah?
A little bit, but not,
Is that a little bit or a lot?
Little bit-ish. A little bit and a bit, maybe a bit more, not lots.
Okay. Well, it's just helpful to know where I'm going. I'm not going to give a kind of reader paper. I've got some slides that I'd like to sort of talk about with you, and hopefully then discuss with you. I'm not sort of able to manage doing that and look at chat and stuff at the same time. So if there's anything really vital happening I don't know if you have the chat going, do you, Del, or not?
Rarely.
Okay.
Just let's chat as we're chatting now.
Okay.
That would be great. And I think if you assume that for a lot of us, we haven't got the knowledge that maybe we should have with regard to Fanon. So please.
Okay. Well, I'll start there. And here's someone else. And we can build up from there together, hopefully, and stop me. Well, if there's anything, anyone really wants to interrupt me, that's and ask something as we go along, possibly around points of clarification rather than having a big debate. I'm happy to be interrupted, okay? And Del, stop me if I go on too long, because we need to have plenty of time for discussion. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you will. So I press share screen, yes. Here we go. And right, slideshow. Slideshow from beginning. So yes, this is my title, yeah, one of the relevant positionings that I bring to my I suppose my credentials to talk with you is as a group analyst as well as an academic, as Del was saying, and I'm not an expert on phenomenology, so by any means. So in a way, I hope this is going to be a sort of, a joint elaboration of some of this theme of Fanon and his phenomenological, psychopolitical therapeutic practice. Sorry, quite a mouthful there. But it has sort of some of the key words in there, doesn't it? Phenomenology, politics, psychopolitics, therapy, and praxis. So I think this is sort of what I said I'd talk about. Fanon as a revolutionary psychiatrist, a revolutionary and a psychiatrist, and an activist. So lots of people know him for his political writings. Perhaps for some people, that's how he became very well known. But he was a psychiatrist and a phenomenologically informed psychoanalytic informed psychiatrist, though not a psychoanalyst, as some people characterize him as being. But more recently, people have tried to link and thought more deeply about his therapeutic work and his writing about his therapeutic practice, and tried to consider how the therapeutic work links with the political perspectives that he was discussing. Now, I'll say a bit more about, biographically about Fanon for those of you who may not know. But the key thing is that he became director, medical director of the major psychiatric hospital outside Algiers called Blida-Joinville in Algeria, and there he adopted, as I put here, adopted and adapted a particular approach to working that he was trained in when he trained as a psychiatrist in France by Tosquelles, as I'll explain, that was called institutional psychotherapy. Now, I think as a group analyst that institutional psychotherapy is fantastically interesting, and we in the Anglophone world know too little about it and have a lot to learn from it and about it. In particular, I mean, as a group analyst, there's a lot of connections with the therapeutic community movement, and in a way, I see institutional psychotherapy as being a sort of radical therapeutic community analysis. So what I want to talk about is something about Fanon and his work, obviously, linking the political work or situating the therapeutic work within the political context, and along the way we'll hopefully get some ideas about the role of phenomenology in there as well. Does that sound okay? Yeah? Okay, so here's a picture of Fanon. So some of the iconic images. Lewis Gordon's got a great chapter in Nigel Gibson's book on 2011 book on Fanon, sort of analyzing these images and their orientation and when they were taken. And by the way, it is in fact getting on for the well, it's almost exactly 60 years since Fanon died. So it's particularly, I suppose, opportune to be giving this lecture today. Earlier on this week, I went to a really interesting, well, a really interesting day seminar convened from a university in Ireland called Fanon in Ireland, that was revisiting the legacy of Fanon's work and its relevance now also in the context of Ireland and Ireland's own sort of politics of race and culture and sexuality and gender, and its own status as a colony of Britain. So that was really interesting, and I might refer to some of that later on. So just thinking about where Fanon was coming from, Fanon was from Martinique, which remains a sort of department politically of France. It was a French colony, and it still has it has quasi autonomous status now, but but people in Martinique are French citizens, and the context where Fanon grew up was one where he was taught to believe himself to be a French citizen, and all the kind of, and David Macy in his biography of Fanon makes quite a lot of the way in which Martinique and other French colonies sort of appear visually in representations of France and the French territories. So this is like an example of it. Here's France. This is the administration of Paris. And then sort of as if plucked from nowhere, you have Martinique. This is Martinique. This is Guadeloupe, also one of the French West Indies. This, I think, is Réunion, and this is French, I think, French Guiana, and so you see that the kind of it's kind of weird that the French imaginary constructs these colonial territories as proximal, not quite part of France, but sort of belonging to France, when they are, of course, thousands and thousands of miles away. I mean, this is the case for all colonial territories, but obviously every form of colonialism and every nation's colonialism, if it has an imperial colonial history, that it's done in its own particular way, and French colonialism is the one we're going to be concerned with mainly today, though I think we should think about wider resonances. So I think these thinking about this and what Fanon encountered when he did come to France and found himself a second-class citizen as a Black man, as is he famously discussed, is very interesting. And just in terms of visual representations, here then is Algeria. So Fanon came from Martinique. He fought for the Free French in the Second World War, was awarded medals and things. As a result of that, he studied in France. I think he started off, was it in dentistry or something? Anyway, he moved to psychiatry, and it was after having a not very successful first clinical job somewhere in, I think, Brittany, he took this medical directorship in Algiers, in Blida-Joinville. And Algeria is a really, really significant country in terms of thinking about the history of colonialism, of anti-colonial struggles, also in terms of post-structuralism, actually. Bourdieu was in Algeria at the same time. He was a French colonial official. Derrida was Algerian, Camus. So there's quite in fact, Miriam Halley-Davis, who was one of the speakers at this Fanon in Ireland conference earlier this week, she's actually written about sort of Algeria and its relationship with French post-structuralist theory, to think about that. It is, of course, a huge country. I think it might be the biggest country in Africa. So it's a significant location, let's say. Now, back to Fanon. As I said, he was born in Martinique, which is in the French Antilles. And he is known to have been a revolutionary as well as a psychiatrist and a key theorist of colonization, of the experience of being colonized, of the political dynamics of colonization, and also of decolonization. And of course, when he was writing about decolonization, I mean, it wasn't post-colonial studies, it was decolonization. He was involved directly in anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s and 60s. He was involved in discussions about that from his school days in Martinique, right through his student days in Paris, and then became directly involved in a much more explicitly political way in Algeria. And in a way, that experience of being in Algeria is understood to have politicized him. Though, he arrived, he only spent about 3.5 years, I think, in Algeria. And working as this medical director of Blida-Joinville, and as a result of the experiences there, in the end, the situation became untenable, partly because he was becoming more and more politically involved and and his political activities were bringing him under suspicion of the French authorities. And remember that being occupying a role of being a doctor, let alone a clinical director of a major hospital, it's a public appointment, a state appointment from France. So it became very untenable. Indeed, he probably would have been assassinated if he'd stayed longer. So he then resigned, went into exile in Tunis, and he became, I mean, he moved from sort of supporting and the FLN, the Front Libération Nationale, to becoming more or less a spokesperson for them, and supporting them in lots of ways, not only intellectually and philosophically, but also as a psychiatrist, supporting the soldiers and thinking through the sort of strategies. And overall, Fanon is known for connecting the political conditions of alienation with psychic suffering. So for Fanon, you know, one of the key things that colonization and racialization and marginalization does is alienate oneself from others, but also from major aspects of oneself. And that, you know, you can see here that Fanon's Marxism as well. I mean, he was, I suppose, more of a socialist than a Marxism, because he had an anti-colonial critique of Marxism for not taking, in his view, not taking colonization issues seriously enough, but very influenced by Marxist and socialist discussions. And he developed this analysis, a very important analysis of how alienation is a major cause of distress, of psychic suffering, and that alienation is not only, perhaps some part of it might be constitutive in being a human being, but a lot of it is caused by oppression, the experience of oppression. And you note that he had a short life, so it is well, there's a lot of discussion about that. He wrote 4 books in that short life. He had a very full life, albeit short. And if you don't know them, this is Black Skin, White Masks, Peau Noire, Masque Blanc. And obviously he published in French initially. That was his first book. Apparently, initially he wrote it and tried to submit it as his MD. It was rejected, and he then wrote another more orthodox psychiatric kind of study that commentators make quite a big deal about, saying effectively it's saying many of the same things but coded in more medical, diagnostic kind of psychiatric ways. And the second book, A Dying Colonialism, was written in the throes of the Algerian Revolution. Its French title translates actually as Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. The Spanish title is rather misleading, perhaps, but also, well, a bit misleading. Sociology of a Revolution is how it translates. And the book that he is probably the most well known. It's called The Wretched of the Earth, which and all of these books are kind of blend. They have both political analysis in them and analysis of the politics of psychiatry and mental health, and the relationship between that politics of mental health and the conditions in which people live their lives, and racialization and colonialism, and particularly the Algerian context. But the Wretched of the Earth is also very well known for the last third of it, as you probably know, many of you, is basically a catalogue of the mental health well, I think it's called colonial wars and mental disorders and it has case histories and typologies of all the of many different kinds of distress, from psychosis to dissociation to all kinds of things, partly caused by torture and other forms of colonial atrocity and abuse, and the experience of colonization. And the fourth book, which is really composed of pieces of political writing that some of which were anonymous, but are attributed to Fanon, is called Towards the African Revolution. So those are the books that he's known for. And you know, there's lots of discussions about what the relationship is between these books, whether they are sort of whether he changes his mind as he goes through the arguments, or as he has more direct political experience, or whether there is a substantial continuity of themes from Black Skin, White Masks, which is in some ways is a more kind of, it's more about the psychology of oppression and racialization, colonialism, and the sort of psychic effects, right through to Wretched of the Earth, which includes essays about the suspicion of popularism, and is looking ahead to what might happen after the revolution in Algeria, and the worry that in a sense some of the elite of the colonized who take over power might reproduce some of the same dynamics as the colonizers. So I'm of the opinion that there is great continuity across those texts. I mean, they don't span a great deal of years. He had a short life, but to me, there is significant interrelationship both between the sort of psychological and psychoanalytic analysis and the political analysis, and the continuity of themes chronologically throughout the books. And in a sense, part of the point is that he really did try and put the political and the psychic together. Moving on, I think that Fanon's work's really important. I mean, especially in the last couple of years, Fanon's work has gone in and out of sort of people's awareness over the last, 60 years since he died. He really was trying to think about the politics of institutional change and the psychological side of it, as well as the political side. As I said, he was a socialist, if not a Marxist. That's very important. That he's talking about class struggle in an anti-colonial and its role in anti-colonial context. You could also say he's kind of trying. I mean, the word intersectionality hadn't been invented in the 1950s and 60s, but he is also talking about the class, race, and gender intersections to an extent. I mean, maybe not enough, but we could come back to some of that, and there's certainly plenty of criticisms of Fanon that could be made on some of those scores. I'm not a hagiography for sort of apologist for Fanon's some of Fanon's limitations, let's say. There are important links that Fanon was really engaged with psychoanalysis and phenomenology, but was pushing to make them even more socially based. Specifically, he wrote extensively about the traumatic effects of racialization, of being labeled as something that you didn't understand yourself to be, and especially if it was stigmatized and marginalized. That's sort of part of what's going on in Black Skin, White Masks, the effects of that for principally, he's addressing the racialized other, the marginalized one, but he's addressing white people as well as Black people in all his books. That's important. And he's also addressing the how these experiences deplete oneself, the depleting and brutalizing impacts of the experience of being colonized, racialized, and of course of the war. And I mean, the Algerian war of independence, or the struggle, that, I mean, it went on for years. It was really, really violent. There was extensive torture and massacres. And if you read David Macy's biography of Fanon, it's a catalogue of atrocities and massacres, I'm afraid, that compose the Algerian war, because you have to situate Fanon's sort of slight change of political positioning at different points in relation to that, what was happening during that war too. Yes, so I've already said, he really did try and say, especially in a dying colonialism, but even in Black Skin, White Masks, he's saying the experience of, that there are gender and class specific forms of racialization. And that these things matter, and in that sense, I think he's anticipating. And many feminists have become very interested in his readings of subjectivity and the complexity and sensitivity of some of his analyses. Now, I think that in a way, what Fanon offers is a sort of more interesting and more useful account of these kinds of dynamics than, say, the group analytic concept of the social unconscious, which kind of gets to be a bit generalized unless you really push it. There are all these concepts we have to put to work. And I suppose, some people, I know there's a lot of thinking about this term microaggressions. I've only recently decided that, maybe there's more to it than I initially thought, but partly, I sort of think, well, how do you distinguish a microaggression from a macroaggression? Although I suppose that's the point, that the microaggression really does reinstall the macro. But certainly, these issues are all aligned. There's been a lot of sort of online seminars around Fanon in the last year or so, and there was one that Homi Bhabha, who has also, is a major post-colonial theorist. He wrote a major introduction to perhaps the second edition of Black Skin, White Masks. His work on Fanon is very well known, but he gave a lecture just a couple of months ago on Fanon's relevance and thinking about Fanon in relation to systemic and everyday racism. So people are really, really remembering Fanon now and using him. Here are some more images of him. I think there are 4 ways that we can think about Fanon informing ideas about therapy, both the theory and practice. One of the terms that I think Derek Hook really kind of, who's written quite a lot about Fanon, he's a white South African emigre now in Boston. He was in the UK for a bit, a Lacanian. Analysed the psychodynamics of race a great deal, also from the apartheid archives in South Africa. This term psychoaffective, this is not the new materialist notion currently circulating of affect particularly, but affect meaning emotions in general, as a psychoanalytic, psychodynamic approach that really engages with affects in a broader sense than emotions, that brings in the body in action, the body in relationship, and the history of those embodied experiences, and how those experiences then inform reflection, thinking, and the capacities for relationship and interaction. But psychoaffective is, as well as psychopolitical, are two important words associated with Fanon. Secondly, you know, as well as being very committed to therapeutic work as a psychiatrist, and he really was, and very committed to, you know, in some ways some quite conventional and some of it very conventional psychiatric work. I mean, he did use drugs and ECT. We shouldn't forget that as well. But he was also formulating major critiques of the cultural presumptions and specificities of those models, and they're, you know, coming from that socialist analysis or socially based analysis, a critique of the individualist notions and abstraction from the social structured into psychoanalytic and psychiatric models. And so he counterposed what he called sociogeny. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but this sociogeny was a counterpoint to, or a critique of the ontogenetic accounts. So he was saying we have to understand the individual as a social being, as having grown up in and being constructed in and through societal, social, political dynamics. Yeah. And of course, what this means is taking lived experience seriously, which includes necessarily experiences of oppression. And this is where the link with phenomenology comes in some ways. So just to think about phenomenology a bit, it's very well known that, I mean, Fanon read very widely. He was up to speed with all the debates going on and discussions in philosophy happening, and all the lectures going on in by major people like Merleau-Ponty in Paris in the 1950s. And he read Sartre very deeply, and he refers a lot to Sartre and admired him hugely, as also Simone de Beauvoir. And indeed, they, you know, not long before he died, they did all meet up and spent a very intense weekend together, or a few days. Now, you might know that Sartre wrote the preface to, I mean, Fanon invited him, he asked him to write the preface to his last book, Wretched of the Earth, that he was preparing at that time. And it's a bit of a poisoned chalice, this preface, it has to be said, because in a sense, I think, you know, and that's not only me, but that Sartre had a slightly different agenda than Fanon and address, really, in writing that preface. And one of the reasons that the book was banned on publication by France, although it circulated clandestinely, was partly because of, you know, the oversimplification and I think misrepresentation of Fanon's claims about violence in that preface, which sort of set up the wrong reading, perhaps. But there's a lot of discussion about this. But anyway, Fanon, but Sartre writing the preface was, of course, a huge boost to the interest in the book. So that's why I say it was sort of double kind of, you know, mixed thing, but very significant, of course. And they influenced each other. I mean, Fanon influenced Sartre as well as the other way around. I think there's something interesting about probably Fanon's sexism, that in some ways he perhaps failed to acknowledge Simone de Beauvoir's influence as much as he did Sartre. For instance, the beginning, something that I think is very interesting as someone who's not only a group analyst, but a theorist of, you know, sort of, I'm very interested in the politics of childhood and the ways we, well, the iconography of children and childhood in the European imagination, let's say, and its history. But in Black Skin, White Mask begins and ends with a very similar claim that Fanon attributes initially to Nietzsche, which is something like the tragedy of man is that he was once a child. And he attributes it to Nietzsche, but in fact, the commentaries actually trace that this comes from Simone de Beauvoir, making a parallel argument in her book, The Second Sex. So yeah, so we can discuss that too. And indeed, you know, Beauvoir was influenced by Fanon, and she, you know, became more involved in some of the taking a kind of more explicitly political stand in France around some of the the atrocities committed against Algerians, particularly Algerian women, and she got involved directly in campaigning to support a particular detained woman activist, etc. So yes, very interesting, that direct relationship between them, all quite well documented now. What does Fanon get from phenomenology? Well, I mean, he's a materialist. As a socialist, he's a materialist. You know, he engages quite directly with some, you know, Marxist debates, but it's an embodied materialist account. It's that attends to. There isn't a reduction to politics or the social, nor is there a reduction to the individual. He's maintaining the importance of both. But the attention to specific geopolitical conditions is really, really important, as well as how those specific geopolitical conditions impact on and inscribe the psyche and the history of the psyche. That's where the tragedy of the child being once a child, the tragedy of man being once a child, I think is a psychodynamic, a psychoanalytic commitment to the importance of early experience in shaping one's capacities for being receptive to engagement and changing those capacities or depleting or reducing them. Yes, so as I said before, Fanon knew about Merleau-Ponty, Sartre. Yes, you see here you have the quote from Macy here. This was the philosophy that could best be adapted to an analysis of his own lived experience. And he read Sartre's key books as they came out, and adapt. I mean, Fanon was really great at just taking what he needed to develop his own analyses, it has to be said. And you can see that in his very eclectic use of different psychoanalytic theorists, for instance, too. That, you know, there aren't many people who would cite Jung and Lacan and Adler all in the same text, but he does that in Black Skin, White Masks for different purposes. What he does is build from these resources a psychosocial, psychoaffective account of what it means to be alive and being, I mean, and particularly in Black Skin, White Masks, being Black in a white dominated world. And Fanon is very well known for having attested to that experience, but one of the newer readings of Fanon is that we shouldn't just be looking to Fanon for telling us about the impacts of racism, but rather that, you know, he's actually a major social and political theorist in general, through that specificity, that he's he's offering a more radically social theory than some of the other social theorists of the European canon that are typically mobilized, like Althusser or sorry, and that should say Foucault here, not Fanon. So someone like Pierre Macheret, a sort of contemporary philosopher, says that Fanon offers a better social theory than Althusser or Foucault, perhaps, in the particular attention to specific material contexts, and how they produce particular, specific, embodied, subjectivities. Yeah. Okay, so these are some of the new books that really connect with the discussions of Fanon and therapy. Nigel Gibson and Roberto Beneduce's book is a sort of commentary on all his psychiatric writings. It's a really, really interesting read. This is the Lou Turner and Helen Neville book is edited collection that's very very global in its reach. You've got sort of chapters on working with sort of Aboriginal communities in Australia, right, you know, and all over the world. This book has just come out. Well, I think it's because I think it's now out. I got an advance copy because I endorsed it. This is a sort of compilation. So you all might be interested in this, since it brings together a lot of the discussions about Fanon and phenomenology. So it's a collection of it's like a reader really on Fanon phenomenology. And then, of course, this is my book, where I'm really interested in reading Fanon through some discussions, contemporary discussions in post-colonial theory, and particularly in relation to disrupting some of the dominant discussions around models of childhood and education. But I write that as a group analyst. So there's quite a lot of psychoanalysis and exploration of the politics of childhood in our contemporary socio-political thinking in there. And this is probably a key resource for any of you really interested in his psychiatric writings, which is a huge labor of love on the part of Jean Khalfa and Robert Young, where they've basically assembled everything that Fanon ever wrote, which includes plays, it includes the editorials to all the newspaper or journal that he set up in Blida-Joinville to try and get staff and patients to write. He was very committed to writing. He thought writing was a really great way of people sustaining and assembling themselves. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's really, really very telling, because he was a passionate writer himself. And it's all of that, along with all the papers, the psychiatric papers that he wrote and co-wrote. And he trained a lot of mental health professionals when he was in Blida-Joinville, and co-wrote quite a number of papers with them, as well as writing with his mentor Tosquelles. So there are all these papers together, as well as the political writings. And even at the end of the book, there's a sort of an account of looking through the books in his library, Fanon's library, and seeing what he wrote in the margins of all the books that he read. So really, it's a huge resource to Fanon scholars, and it's a very big book, but not very expensive, actually, it has to be said. Anyway, everyone is saying this is a really amazing resource. There was yeah, so better move on. Okay, so 4 ways. The fourth way then that Fanon informs therapeutic theories and practices is, of course, his political engagement. And so I'll just say a bit more about that. So he was a psychiatrist, and he did go to Algiers and he reformed and radically transformed the mental hospital in Blida-Joinville, which was, it was only one of, I think, 3 or 4 psychiatric hospitals in Algeria at that time. And, it was pretty well releasing patients from their chains, not quite, but pretty well like that. It was really basic. It wasn't very psychologically minded, we would say now. And he tried to apply the models that he'd learnt in his training with Tosquelles, who I'll say more about in a bit, there, and establish a kind of therapeutic community approach. And I'll give some examples of some of that work. I mean, some of it didn't work for very interesting reasons, and some of it did. But alongside doing that work of mental health practice and reform, and trying to train staff to be more engaged with patients in a more humane way and a more psychodynamically minded way, he also got involved in sheltering freedom fighters and activists in the hospital and treating them for the psychological effects of being involved in direct anti-colonial struggle. But one of the strange and difficult things that occurred is that, both those who were tortured, but also the torturers were turning up in the hospital to be treated for the psychological effects of what had been done to them and what they were doing. And even on some occasions encountered each other. So you can imagine this was not a therapeutic environment at that point. And in the end, he resigned, as I said, and his resignation letter is really worth, I think, is really worth attending to. I mean, Fanon is not someone who romanticized madness. He really did believe that it was an awful thing, that one of the ways that humans have of losing their freedom. And you can see here that he's saying, this country, that the inhabitants of this country are alienated, the alienation causes madness. And he's making very big statements about professional responsibilities here that I think we have to think about all the time. I think it's just so relevant. And I teach counseling psychology trainees, and as well as other people. And I kind of say to them, we have to look at this and think about what we do. What are our responsibilities? I owe it to myself. If psychiatry, we could read, therapy or whatever here, is the technique that sets out to enable individuals to no longer be foreign to their environment, I owe it to myself to state that the Arab, this is the colonized, permanently alienated in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. The troubles in Algeria are the logical consequence of an abortive attempt to de-cerebralize a people. So he understood colonization as a psychic assault, a psychic, as chopping up the mind, the brain, and saying the function of a social structure is to set up institutions that are traversed by a concern for humankind. That's what a psychiatric hospital is supposed to be. A society that forces its members into desperate solutions is a non-viable society that needs replacing. The citizen's duty is to say no. No professional morality, no class solidarity, no desire to refrain from washing the dirty linen in public, must be a French version of our English phrase of that, can have a prior claim. No pseudo-national mystification finds grace when used against the demand to think. So that's what he wrote to the French president in resigning. And it was a very principled position, but his position really, was becoming existentially unlivable, impossible as well. So it was a deeply political decision, but thinking now about actually his therapeutic work, I want to say, before I finish, a bit about institutional psychotherapy. So when Fanon came to France, he eventually went to study and train as an intern with, oh, here's Ben Jones, with Tosquelles in Lyon, and a hospital called Saint-Andal, which has a very interesting history also in relation to the Second World War. And in a way, what that model is quite, I would say, quite close to some of the sort of English language group therapies that were emerging in the 1940s and 50s, that, you know, that in Northfield, etc., that we know about. But Tosquelles has a different political history. He was a part of the anti-fascist struggle in the Civil War in Spain. He was in exile from Spain, coming over the border at Saint-Albin, was in the south of France. And he himself, well, he was, like Fanon was to do, he supported the guerrilla fighters in the anti-fascist struggle to manage their sort of psychological responses to terror, and in managing their in being militarily active, and so that, you know, Fanon had precedents here, and Tosquelles himself was imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp, and he was organizing on the French border, and he was organized with other people, and he really developed a very interest, as well as having been already involved in very interesting developments in the sort of Catalan nationalist movement, which placed mental health issues at the center. Camila Robsis has written very interestingly about this. He developed the ideas of institutional psychotherapy from, you know, partly from this experience that you can't cure individuals if they're in a really sick, terrible, institution. You have to cure the institution itself, and that might include beyond the institution to the society, before the individual can be healed. Yeah. Now, alongside that, there's a lot of things that look at quite like general therapeutic community commitments of being involved in daily activities that are social, productive, you know, and regular. And they had psychoanalytic individual and group work in this model as well. And you can read about that. So, I mean, I think it's really, really interesting. There's overlap with what we know from the sort of Anglo-Saxon traditions, but there are some differences and some interesting ones. So, as I've said about Tosquelles, one of the things that's really interesting about Tosquelles is how, when he came over the Pyrenees, escaping from France, it is argued that he that he brought with him the as yet unpublished copy of Lacan's PhD thesis, which he then photocopied and insisted on his interns reading when he was in Saint-Albin. And he trained some pretty important people. I mean, as well as Fanon, there was Jean-Henri there was Canguilhem, who taught and supervised Foucault, and lots of other people. So basically what Fanon did in Blida-Joinville was really try to reproduce some of what he'd done in Saint-Albin, but obviously it was quite significantly a different context. But still, even though Fanon became a political revolutionary full-time, if you like, once he left Blida-Joinville, he still maintained a psychiatric and therapeutic practice. He continued to work in Tunis and in also in Morocco. He moved a fair bit in those last years, and he set up a course in Tunis on the sociology of mental health, and some very devoted person took notes of his lectures, and they are reproduced, I think, in the Alienation and Freedom in the last chapter or so. So you can see kind of what he was saying, which was sort of about institutional psychotherapy. So he maintained an engagement with direct psychiatric and therapeutic practice to the end, as well as the politics. Not many people manage to do both so directly. Okay, I think some other connections we might make is the debates between nationalism and internationalism. Fanon, you could say, I mean, he was passionate about supporting the Algerian Revolution and Algerian freedom, independence, but he did so as an internationalist. And that's a kind of it's a tricky one to sort of square, but he thought you could only become an internationalist through the freedom gained at a national level, I think. But it's a big debate. He talked about the dangers of populism and spontaneism, in the sense of, you know, rabble rousing and only acting on emotions. He was really, in that sense, although people think of him as a validator of the emotional responses, actually he says at the beginning of Black Skin, White Masks, I couldn't write this book, you know, for a few years because I was too caught up in the emotions. I'm suspicious of fervor, he said. And you can see it in Wretched of the Earth as well. I mean, that's the whole chapter on the dangers of politicians whipping up emotions and using that to manipulate people. And the worries about what, you know, how the native, bourgeois elite can take over the positions of power. And that is just the socialism of Fanon's socialism coming through here, can reproduce some of the same structures of oppression. Okay, so we know that Fanon offered a psychosocial account of identity formation. And this is linked to a lot of, I mean, misrecognition is a very key philosophical term here, isn't it? You could see it in a Lacanian sense, but beyond that, a Sartrean sense. In Black Skin, White Masks, he describes this in great detail. This is what people kind of really focus on in their reading of Black Skin, White Masks as a rule. But one of the things that's very important, I think, in the reading of Fanon is how he, as well as acknowledging the power of these traumatic experiences, and in that point, in the middle of Black Skin, White Masks, saying, you know, okay, so I'm Black, so I'm going to celebrate the Blackness, kind of thing. By the end of the book, he's asking a lot of questions and resisting some kind of any essentialist account of a collective past that you would unify people. Instead, I think that Fanon was talking about collectivity being forged through practice, and in that sense, Fanon was quite critical of the negritude movement that he debated with some of the key other sort of Black and Pan-African thinkers of the time around these themes in some very important conferences. Another important theme is around language and power. I mean, there's whole sets of issues we could spend a long time thinking about the way in which language and power comes into our reading of Fanon, including the whole question of translation. I mean, one of the really interesting papers at the Fanon in Ireland, and there's a book on edited by Catherine Batchelor about specifically about the translation of and reception of Wretched of the Earth. She is a professor of translation studies. You know, the book and the cover, the images on the front, radically different in different languages, different cultures. They've been received differently. The books have been translated in different order, etc. But for Fanon, the language is very important. To speak means above all to assume a culture to support the weight of a civilization. To speak is to take on a world, a culture. And he describes that in terms of, you know, the going back to Martinique, or how the French educated Martinican returning to France is evaluated for, you know, his accent, or her accent, or probably would be his, wouldn't it, at that time, and how the mastery of the colonizer's language, or the capacity to, or being told that you speak French very well, kind of, you know, is one of the forms of racism he encountered, etc. But there's also a really interesting phrase that in Black Skin, White Masks, where he describes language as the retaining wall relation to the group, that I think is very fruitful. I mean, he's a very poetic and inspirational writer, but I think that you can see this perhaps in some of the quotes I'm giving. In terms of his mental health practice, how much longer should I talk for, Dal, do you think?
It's another up to 10 minutes.
Up to 10 minutes. Okay. So in Blida-Joinville, I mean, Fanon, it has to be said, Fanon didn't learn Arabic. I mean, he didn't have time to learn Arabic. He was mortified, apparently, that he didn't. And I think he learned a little Derja, but so he had to work through interpreters. So that's all very interesting when you read the case histories, okay. But he kind of knew, I mean, the anti-colonial, or the critique of colonialism that his lens that he brought to mental health practices is still, I think, very productive. So that there's a paper in Alienation and Freedom about trying to, you know, what happened. I mean, I think he gave it as a conference paper. I think it's co-written. Yes, Fanon and Geronimi. Geronimi was one of his major collaborators in Blida-Joinville, and has written about his memories of Fanon, of using the TAT, the thematic apperception test, which is a sort of story completion test. That's a sort of assessment or projective assessment tool, and it's still widely used, isn't it? And basically, you know, they tried using this test with some of the Muslim women patients, the Algerian women patients in a psychiatric hospital, and these women just weren't able to generate a story. And what Fanon says about this is not simply that, you know, the stimulus items were culturally irrelevant or not embedded in the local locale, that sort of thing, but actually there's something more fundamentally wrong about the assumptions structured into the test. And, you know, Fanon really liked the TAT. If he'd lived longer, he would have, there's evidence that he was trying to develop a better version of it that could be used in the Algerian context. But he said, but in the context of understanding why and how the women seem to appear as if they couldn't formulate a story, he offers a different explanation. He says the incoherent, inappropriate, vague and disjointed replies, they all indicate that our method has something wrong with it. And he's saying our patients' inadaptation is a correlate of the method's inadequacy. So he's reversing, instead of, you know, pathologizing the patient, he's taking that the encounter and the evidence of that encounter seriously to reflect back on the practice, which is, I think, you know, a very interesting move that comes from a sensitivity to the dynamics of colonization, and also the gendered relationship. I mean, he writes, he was very concerned about how Muslim women in the hospitals were, a lot of them was effectively abandoned, and it was terribly overcrowded. There's lots of papers, there's lots of reproduced letters to French state officials asking for more resources, because they, the hospital was really under-resourced, overcrowded, but also a lot of the patients had nowhere to go back to, especially the women. And so in that sense, he was really doing general advocacy work, as he should do as a clinical director of a mental hospital. And I mean, I think that, I don't know how much, I'll give this as perhaps the last example. There's a paper by Fanon and Lacaton where they were invited to do a medico-legal assessment because there was a phenomenon, and it seemed to recur, of Algerian men being picked up for crimes by, by the police. And when they came to court, sometimes they'd say they were guilty, sometimes they deny it. And this instability or unreliability caused consternation on the part of the French state officials and the sort of judges. They didn't know what to do with this kind of relation. And Fanon and Lacaton interpret that retraction not as an indication of backward or primitive thinking. And let's remember that psychiatry, that the Porot school of psychiatry was explicitly legitimating French colonization by saying that Algerians were, backward, primitive, lazy, all the rest of, had smaller brains, or you name it, they said it. It was the worst form of racist colonial psychiatry. So Fanon writes a great deal attacking that model and now offering another interpretation of what's going on when these men appear to be completely all over the place, unreliable, even in whether they're claiming they're guilty or not guilty. And he's saying, they are saying that in a sense, you can understand this as being about a dilemma for the accused about whether they are willing, or what the psychic costs of recognizing the court are. The confession of his act depends upon the confession of the group. And he's saying, look, this is a context of great inequality, of colonial oppression. There can be no integration if there has been no integration. For the criminal to recognize his act before a judge is to, agree that it's wrong, to legitimize the eruption of the public into the private by denying, by retracting. The North African is refusing this. What we probably see concretized in this way, so they're offering an interpretation, is the total separation between the two social groups, such as the Algerians and the French occupiers, that coexist, alas, tragically, but where the integration of one by the other has not begun. So, I mean, this is really important. The accused Muslims' refusal. So, I mean, Fanon talks about Algerian and Muslim as sort of equivalent terms. The accused Muslims' refusal to authenticate by confessing his act, the social contract proposed to him, means that his often profound submission to the powers that be, in this instance, the power of the judiciary, cannot be confounded with an acceptance of that power. So this is a whole other way of thinking about a lot of the institutional practices that we as mental health professionals, I think, get involved with. I think it's very productive. So as I was saying, this adds up to a psychopolitical, a psychoaffective account that you could link up with some other kind of concepts certainly in group analytic theory. And Fanon, in the phenomenological terms or existentialist terms, is also very engaged with the transformational possibilities of becoming. We could think about this in relation to our recent experiences of the pandemic, of the ways in which we know the pandemic has intensified as well as reproduced all kinds of racialized inequalities. And in terms of the whole, the resurgence of attention to Fanon through the, partly through the Black Lives Matter campaigns, prompted in part by the murder of George Floyd, the whole question of being able to breathe, of course, it's there right through Fanon's writing about the colonized being asphyxiated by colonialism. And he ends A Dying Colonialism by talking about the very last page is about how the revolution, creates is the oxygen which creates and shapes a new humanity. I think I'd better stop, or we won't have time. I mean, I've got lots more slides, but I think I'd better stop there so that we can talk some more.
Erica, thank you so much. It's just wow, it's so relevant, isn't it? Something that you and others have brought to us from the 50s, 60s to today. I was particularly caught by the institutional psychotherapy notion, just the idea that, rather than focus on the individual, what you need a healthy organization, a healthy hospital before the people inside it can be. Yeah, there was that sort of dimension which seemed beyond just looking individual or even just looking at a group. Yeah, and and I suppose I'm wondering if you can say more about something of this. And it's an impossible question, I think I'm asking, but he was talking about how one might collectively forge this through practice. Yeah. So I'm wondering, how can we collectively forge something through practice where we look beyond just the individual as if it's the individual's problems? And I wonder, it seems like at least a level of the state, a level of the organization, and the level of which most of us here are involved in one-to-one practice. I once took a group of students to France, and we went to a hospital where Marquis de Sade was at one stage, and I was fascinated how the family therapists looked at the health service workers working with a family as a family rather than focusing on the family. Yeah. And I just wonder, transformational practice, any sort of one-liners, how we might operationalize this, if not on the level of the state, which might take you more than a minute, to the institutions, how can we, is there something that we can look at further with regards to institutional psychotherapy in terms of references or something you might say, which I'm particularly interested in? And the final one is, what thoughts for our practice on the one-to-one?
Right. Well, there's a huge amount there, isn't it? Yes. And I can just see someone's asked, can you have the slides? And yes, of course you can, etc. I'll send them over, because obviously the quotes from Fanon just so kind of evocative and quite hard to digest sometimes. They merit some dwelling over. I think. I first of all, I'll say, Fanon really was a psychiatrist. He didn't disbelieve in, he didn't romanticize distress. I think but he believed in therapy. It's interesting that Basaglia, some of you might know, the work in Trieste, where the deinstitutionalization processes, where Franco Basaglia set up, they closed the big mental hospital. Mental health became a big campaigning issue briefly in Italy, and they closed the big mental hospital in Trieste and turned it into a whole other kind of environment. And the workers, the psychiatrists sort of worked alongside the patients, etc., etc. And I do remember going there in the early 1980s and seeing some graffiti that said in French saying, Basaglia closed the hospital and put the patients in the chains of labor because work was deemed very important, including paid employment. But it's interesting that now the clinics and where Basaglia worked, that it's called the center, the Frantz Fanon Center, but Basaglia hated psychotherapy. But Fanon really believed, he really believed that therapy could do something. And so he really did do what looks like, if you read the papers, quite like classical sort of analytic in group work. But the difference, the difference comes in a number of ways. Here in Britain, we suffer from, great cultural legacies of individualism and depoliticization, and it seems like a big step to take to think of ourselves as being political in our work, and you can see that in the day-to-day practice Fanon could not be. Was he going to say to these sort of torture victims, you can't come and be a patient here because it puts me in danger? All these guerrilla fighters, he couldn't as an ethical practitioner. And there are all over the world, there are people doing fantastic psychoanalytic sort of political work, but that tradition is being, we suffer from a great historical and cultural amnesia here in Britain. People are doing fantastic work in Brazil and the favelas. That kind of is something, it's psychoanalytic work, but it's also community development work. It connects up the history of slavery with contemporary police violence against Black people, as well as the history and the memories of the dictatorship and the actual resonances of that in the current political regime, of which there's quite a lot now, increasingly, etc., etc. So, and if you think about how Freud's the free clinics in Berlin and Budapest and Vienna, and that Freud explicitly, promoted and said, yes, psychoanalysis should be free, and that they were doing family therapy, couples therapy, group work, as well as individual work. And if Reich had had his way for longer, they'd be doing a lot more political work. It was all happening, but it got closed down. And so much of psychoanalytic practice became adapted because those the analysts came to Britain and the US, and the histories that a lot of us know about, and adapted to, they had to look like good refugees, didn't they? So, and there's similar discussions going on about the sort of insertion and reception of psychoanalysis in Israel-Palestine, about what that has done to psychoanalytic practice there, etc. too. So, which is that discussion explicitly informed by psychoanalytic practice. Oh, someone's waving. Hello. So I think there's a huge amount we can take. People are and we are, Fanon is an inspirational writer, and I think we should be inspired. And maybe he was a very exceptional person, or maybe he was a person who was put in some very challenging situations and just had to act. But he's into reflection before action, or action through reflection, and he talks about being actional. That seems very sort of phenomenological to me, and his model is so thoroughly social that I think it offers a great deal to us in inviting us to really look at the theories that we use. Especially in Black Skin, White Masks, he's kind of saying, this theory doesn't, okay, so he says there's no Oedipus complex in the Antilles. Well, maybe it's overstating it, but he's he's really onto something, isn't he? In starting that kind of debate about the nuts and bolts of our models and what needs to be decolonized in our models, how we need to think differently about the tools that we use, as well as how what we do with us, in our therapy.
Erica, thank you. I must open it up to others, please. Some further questions, comments?
Can I just jump in, or is there some sort of a queuing system here?
Yeah, yes, you're first.
Yeah, yeah, I jumped in front of the line. I was just wondering, Erica, have you noticed, or did he discuss anywhere? Because he when he came from Martinique, he was a French citizen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but like in Algeria, there were like Muslims or those who were not did not like leave their religion. They were subjects. They were not French citizens.
Yes.
So I was kind of like wondering that did he write about it, or did that cause, like you mentioned that intersectionality before? So kind of like that, him being in the middle in a sense. So him being a French citizen, he did have those benefits of a citizen, like going to France and having the education and being able to be the head of the hospital, which was not possible for those Algerians he was treating. So he was in a sense like benefiting of the system differently, even though he was part of colonialism, or he was a kind of like under French rule as well. So, but he was in a better position nevertheless. So I was kind of like wondering that did he write about it, or did he reflect upon that?
Well, it's an interesting point here, because Black Skin, White Masks is him writing as as someone coming from Martinique to France and encountering racism. Finding out he was Black, kind of thing. Well, no, he knew but being hailed as Black, and all the or worse actually in the sort of language used, and all the encountering the range of associations that meant, and being and possibly because there is some discussion that because he was a obviously middle-class family, quite an elite family really from Martinique, that the sort of that particularly was particularly shocking perhaps for him. So he was already privileged. He came and found, he encountered oppression and marginalization as through the installation of a vilified, racialized positioning. A lot of people were very patronizing to him, saying, don't you speak French well, or you're quite clever, or this sort of thing. There's plenty of examples of that. But clearly when he went to Algeria, he went as a French state official. He was in an incredibly privileged position. That didn't mean he didn't encounter racism as a Black man. I'm sure there was plenty of it from Algerians to him as a Black man too. But in the end, and there is some sort of psychobiographical discussion about why was Fanon so passionate about wanting to become Algerian, because he was so engaged as a revolutionary that he writes in The Dying Colonialism, we Algerians, and at his funeral he was called an Algerian. Perhaps he was looking for some other kind of place to be recognized and included, but it was one that was built through conscious commitment and struggle. So he basically, he was a senior official and in the hospital, and you can see him complaining about how awful the staff are, and how, and his major struggle was with some of the staff who didn't want to change their practices and thought this therapeutic community lark was a bit peculiar and stupid, and why should you set up cafes and theatres and football groups and you know, and a coffee shop with the patients and for the patients, or a cinema group or whatever. You know, they thought some of them thought that was ridiculous. So he was obviously exercising his authority as a medical director. But then, you know, he surrendered that, didn't he, to work with the FLN.
I wonder if can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
So I wanted just to add something to that. I think this is the area about Fanon being in a sort of liminal space, isn't it? Because
yeah, that's right.
In some ways, there's something about the differences between the people who are Black or the people who are colonized. And I think people from Senegal, for example, were seen to be lower than people from Martinique. So there's already that. And I think he goes to France and fights for the liberation of France. And then actually he's awarded a medal or whatever it is and gets to study. So he's, as you're saying, I think he's already in a different position. He's in a position that's somehow in between the oppressors and the people who are most oppressed. And I suppose it's an obvious thing to say, but that's how white supremacy works, isn't it? That there's white supremacy, which is the best, and then there are the other shades that are differently bad or not as good or something.
Yes, and thank you for that. I mean, he does write, doesn't he, about seeing the racism when he was in the army, particularly around the treatment of the Senegalese soldiers who were sort of used as cannon fodder, were treated as less than human kind of thing. And as well as also in Black Skin, White Mask, talking about remembering from his own childhood being very excited when some Senegalese were visiting, and he says something about running home to his father and saying, "Oh, look at these people." And so he's really critically, I mean, part of what he's writing about, because his address is primarily to those subject to racism and racialization, you know, look at what this does to us. But he's also he says very clearly, this book is for white people and Black people, you know, and in the end, maybe these categories we could envisage a time when they could be redundant, but it has to be in a world that has really addressed racialized injustices, a transformed world. And that's one of the things that's very important, really, to take into account when we think about the status of, say, some of the discussions underway in conflict zones around dialogue and reconciliation. That if you fail to take seriously the radical inequalities in which the dialogue, so-called dialogue, is taking place, then you are contributing to the disempowerment of the oppressed. And this is one of the key points that Lara and Stephen Sheehy are making in their books, Psychoanalysis under Occupation in Palestine, and I think that it's a really important point about not how the political necessarily enters the personal. You can't say, you know, they're separate from each other. So the question is how. And so when people think of Fanon as a theorist of violence, unfortunately, partly through Sartre's preface, as I was saying earlier, I mean, what they mistake is that, you know, that Fanon is talking about it's an almost violent effort to assert oneself in a context of such radical disempowerment, and that the violence is structural, it's already there. So to respond to that is not the violent action. It's moving beyond reacting to becoming actional in his terms. And I mean, that's, I think, what we try and do in therapy. We help people try and think about what these experiences mean, and try and enable them to act, don't we?
Yes. Yes, I certainly think that, and I think we part of that is that we sometimes see the violence of the things that have been done to people, or even the things that they've done, maybe in ways that they don't see it as violence. I think that's true, and I do think that, I think you said it earlier on, that one of the things that people do with Fanon now is that they emphasize violence as if he was an advocate of violence, as opposed to what you're saying, that he's saying that colonialism and oppression generally is violent, and actually there isn't. I don't think he's advocating that you can just have the non-violent response to that and just turn the other cheek. He's saying that you need something quite active.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, I know we're running out of time, but in the one of the last papers he wrote, and it's in at the end of Alienation of Freedom, it's a talk he gave called "Why We Use Violence," and he's saying, look, colonialism works by trying to legitimate itself by eradicating the memory that there has been anything other than colonialism. It tries to make itself look like that's the way it always has been and the way it always will be, and that this is the violence. So to try and disrupt that is it might be, some people might see it as being violent, but that exactly, this violence is already there, and to deviate from that, to not be passive in relation to it, takes some great efforts. I mean, he writes, Black Skin, White Masks is full of words like effort and, the effort to become agentic, to become actional. That's what I think he means by violence. I mean, he's also in this last chapter talking about a particular moment in the Algerian Revolution when all the negotiation options had kind of completely sort of dissolved. Because the French state had betrayed every possible agreement, and this is well documented politically. So it really, he really is saying the armed struggle was a last resort, and indeed in A Dying Colonialism you can see a lot more with the middle book, a lot more possibilities of sort of negotiation and the hope to do that, although some people think it was, he was being a bit over optimistic there.
Eric, I'm going to have to, I know it's a great talk because it feels like we're just starting, which is the sign of things, and it's, thank you for the inspiration and opening up possibilities for us. Our course is called Critical Existential Analytic, and we talk about why we put existential before analytic. Thank you for, I think, providing us with further ammo as to why critical comes before existential or analytic. So thank you so much for that.
All the best.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to say, our next outside speaker is Rosie Risk on the 3rd of February. What the Butler Never Said, From Fiction to Psychoanalysis in Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. So that's for our February talk. So Erica, many thanks. And now put people in a couple of groups. Most people are going to have their eat faster than usual, hopefully, because we're going to meet again at 8 o'clock. Thank you, Erica. Thank you very much again.
All the best. Sorry to eat into your dinner time.
Well worth it. Bye.
Thank you.